morning and a welcome to each one here. If you would open your hymn books back to 552, and I'd like to talk about that just a little bit. I said something, I think it was Wednesday night, about Leonard singing it again or bringing it up again. There was a couple phrases that stood out to me in this song, and this was not by far not a favorite of mine growing up. There was always that older person in church that picked this song, and I didn't really appreciate it that much. But Wednesday night, some things stood out to me, and it was probably more or less what I was inspired to talk about today. That it was like, okay, the words in this song, there's a lot there, and I'd like for you to, if you see something, point it out. What stands out to you in this song? Talking about needing God in our life, and what stands out to you? Joy or pain. Okay. Okay. Those are all things that stood out to me Wednesday night when we sang it, but especially in joy or pain. And I think for most of us, in one or the other, we connect with God naturally, maybe, or it's more natural than the other, and we don't need Him in the other as much, I should say. Um, and the other that stood out to me, stay thou nearby. I see that as an invitation for God to stay there. Temptations lose their power. Thinking of the power that Satan has in temptation, and if we're doing that alone, we have no power to resist that. And I like that phrase there of inviting God to stay. And when you're here, God, I can conquer the things that Satan is throwing my way. So things that stood out to me. Thanks, Leonard, for leading that. Thanks, Tristan, for giving that out the other night. As I was studying, I said Wednesday night as well that I had there's a story that I heard that inspired this message. And I'd like to ask us an obvious question. Who all has problems? Okay? There's a couple perfect people here, but for the most part, most of us are got problems. We're really messed up. And so that's an obvious thing. We all have problems. We all face problems. But the question I'd like to ask is, what do we do in those times of problems? And I'm talking more the things that we face. So yesterday we had a hard rain, and I found out we have a problem with our roof. So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the things that happen to us. Maybe it could be that. Maybe your response to something like that, it might trigger something. I don't know. Maybe we shouldn't say it's not that. But I was thinking more of relationships. I was thinking of things that have caused pain in our life, or things that have happened to us. What do we do with that when those things surface or those things are brought up again? I think the first thing naturally is to find a solution to our problems. But I'd like for us to think about solutions and where we find solutions. The story is of this young man. This young man had some terrible stuff happen to him as a young boy, as a young man. Some things I can't fathom. Some things it's just unimaginable things that happened to this young man. And as he got older, I would say because of that, maybe um, he turned to alcohol. Um, he turned to pornography. He started doing drugs as a way of escaping that pain. Um, and I'd like for us to get a picture of somebody that had some terrible stuff happen, who is now trying to cope with those things, and he's turned to um, these things as a solution to his problems. Later, he gets married, um, and he's secretly holding these things from his wife. And but later, he decides he feels bad about it, and he comes clean and he tells her about it. So now she's got some hard things to deal with, and I don't know her side of the story, um, but later, this was all within, I think, a 4-year span of him getting married, that he eventually came clean, told his wife about it, and then she's obviously dealing with some hard things. Later on, he finds out that his wife had an affair. She's cheating on him. And so he goes back to his coping mechanism of what he's learned to do in life. Um, and then he feels terrible about that, and he comes clean again. And now his question is, what do I do? My wife is wanting a divorce. And so we see a cycle of a young man who has some really bad stuff happening, and he turns to things which creates bad things. And because of those bad things, he turns to bad things. And it's just a vicious cycle of life. And now he's saying, I don't know where to turn. And as we there in Matthew 28, that verse really stood out to me. All power is given to me, to Jesus, and we have access to that. I loved how Leonard explained that in God giving man dominion, but Satan coming and taking that power, or at least a part of that power, and taking it away. And Jesus is saying, it's mine, and I'm giving it back to you. And so we have access to power to have solutions for some of the things we face. What is the solution to this man's problems? Is it weed? Is it alcohol? Is it pornography? We would say no, it's not. It's not a solution. And I see those things as a Xanax. It's just a way of numbing pain, and it's an escape for the discomfort. Many people don't want to live in their own skin, and it's a numbing device to use to escape that. So this morning, or last night and this morning as I was studying, I Googled this. I said, what do people do when they are discouraged or facing hard times? This was Google's response. People often turn to unhealthy solutions during tough times because they offer temporary relief or distraction from difficult emotions, even if they ultimately worsen the situation in the long run. That was Google's response to that question. People often turn to unhealthy solutions during tough times because they offer temporary relief or distraction from difficult emotions, even if they ultimately worsen the situation in the long run. And I asked myself that question, why do people do that? And we say, well, I don't do all those bad things. But I would like for you, as we look through some of this, and you may not be using weed, you may not be a drunkard, but I'd like for you to identify what are you using as the numbing device as such in your life when you face problems, or are you doing well and going to God for that? You don't have to say what that thing is, but I'd like for us to identify if there are those things, and And in studying this, I recognized some things in my life that I wouldn't have said that was the thing I was going to. I wouldn't have said that. And it can be, it may not necessarily be a bad thing that you're going to in those times. Some people go to work, they're just workaholics. Some people may exercise. It's a way of escaping reality and not necessarily getting an answer for what's going on. So I'd like for all of us to at least be open to, are there things that we're turning to um, as a solution to the problems we face? And I will say this, oftentimes, like in the situation of alcohol or drugs or pornography or whatever you want to call it, I think so many times we focus on that as the problem, and that's not, sometimes that's just the solution to a bigger problem that we face. It's a fake solution to a bigger problem that won't go away. In Jeremiah 2 verse 13, it says, "For my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed out cisterns for themselves, broken cisterns that hold no water." And so I think what he's saying here, instead of seeking God, they turn to cisterns or broken cisterns. And I think that would represent a man-made satisfaction, man-made systems, man-made whatever. It's something that offers temporary satisfaction in life, but ultimately fail to provide lasting fulfillment. And this was God's people that he was saying this about. And I think for me, growing up in church, some of the things that were the things we struggled with the most, we talked about the least. And I'd like for us to understand that this is human tendency. And just because we all showed up on time, we have our Sunday best on, does not mean that there are not things that are behind all of that all of us are facing. And I think you look at statistics. If you look at substance abuse in we would say the world versus in the church, we're not that far behind. And they were, I didn't write it down, but the amount of leaders, church leaders that use alcohol, like the percentage was not that different than other people that say they have a problem with it. It did say that there's not a statistic for drugs because obviously they don't want to say they were on drugs, but they said in all the statistics I read, it said that less than 1% come out and say it. And I think in our churches we can kind of forget that there are real problems in all of our lives that we face, and we all have the natural tendency to go back to something that we cope with. I'd like to look at this, the rest of what I'm wanting to talk about, kind of as a story. There's some children here, and I love children, and I love if they get the sermon as well. So I'd like to open like if you would open your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter. We're going to look at chapter 30, but I think we're going to give some backstory as to how David came to this point in his life. So let's start at chapter 16. And I'd like for you to follow through as we kind of jump through here. I'd like for you children to listen as well of the story of David. And I'd like to bring out a point, and it's a simple point of how he learned to cope with problems in life. And I will point out before I forget, there were times in David's life, and we know his story well, where he chose poor choices. He made a poor choice. But I'd like for us to understand that he wasn't successful in those choices. He turned his life around, and we're not going to look at those situations, but I'd like to look at a couple situations. In one particular where David chose wisely. And how was he able to do that? So in 1 Samuel 16, we find the story of David being anointed king of Israel. So how do you become king of Israel? How do you become king? Your dad was a king. Well, that's not the case in David's situation. He's a poor shepherd boy. He's not going to become king. There's not much chance. But we find Samuel coming to Jesse's house, and David is anointed king of Israel. David's a poor shepherd boy. And like I said, he's probably not in the line to become king. But we understand how God rejects Saul from being king, and he said, I'm going to choose someone else who's better. And he chose David to be king of Israel. We find that in chapter 16. In chapter 17, now David knew this, and his family knew that he was anointed king of Israel. But it talks about Samuel being nervous about the fact of, how am I going to tell Saul about this? So Saul was not on board with this. And how is David going to get on the map as such to be the next king? So Samuel's finding himself in that situation. In 1 Samuel 17, David's father calls him, Jesse, calls him, and so Jesse, I think in between this time, David actually was in Saul's presence as a musician. So this, and then he would have went back. I think when Saul went to fight the Philistines, David went back to watching sheep. So Saul would have been aware of who David was, but I don't think he knew who he was by what we read later. So anyway, David's father calls him, and he says, go find your brothers. They're fighting these Philistines, and take them some food. And he gave him some things to take, and asked him to go check on them. So David went, and he gets to the valley of Elah here, and he noticed that Israel has a big problem. So for 40 days, this giant comes out and says, instead of all of us fighting, let's just take me, the champion, against one of your men, and let's just fight it between the two of us. Not all of us have to die, just one of us. And whoever wins, that army will be the winner, and the other army that loses will become our slave. So that's the situation that David comes upon as he's coming to the valley of Elah. And it talks about the Israelites were terrified. I mean, it talks about them running. They're scared. This had been going on for a while. So David shows up to an atmosphere of fear, and he asks, what's happening? Who is this guy? Why are you letting him talk like that to you about your God and about us? And later we know that David said, I'll go fight. And David fights Goliath and defeats him. And now David's name is on the map. Saul notices him, and that's where Saul says, who is this guy? And whose son is he? And he becomes Saul's armor bearer. Go to chapter 18. This is where Saul promotes David. And he basically saw David as someone that had courage to fight this Goliath, or this giant. He said, I'll make him in charge of my army. And so David would lead these armies in and out of Israel. And we see how God was with him, and how God allowed him to be a mighty man of valor, a man of war, and how successful he was in that. And because of that, Saul becomes extremely jealous of him, and even so jealous that he wants to kill David. And we see the one time where David is playing a harp, where he throws his spear at him, and David jumps out of the way, spear hits the wall, and he runs for his life. And all through 1 Samuel 19, 20, 21, 22, and 23, we see Saul's pursuit of David, and he tries to kill this one man who had just miraculously saved Saul's nation from the enemy, and all over jealousy. And even in chapter 19, he tells his son Jonathan to kill David. And we know the history with Jonathan and David, and how David said, or how Jonathan talked his dad out of it at that time, saying, why would you do this to the man that has helped you so much in defeating your enemies? Um, and then Saul agrees to that. Later, um, David went to battle again and had a great victory, and Saul becomes jealous again, and he tries to kill David again with the spear, and David gets out of the way and runs for his life. And later, I think it was that same evening or the next day, Saul goes to his men and says, "Go to David's house and let's kill him during the night or the next morning." And we know how Micah, was it Michael or Michael? I forget what her name was. But anyway, Saul's daughter was married to David. She told David, she said, "If you want to escape, get out of the window now." And she let him out of a window, and he escaped and he ran. So she fixed up this dummy, this fake person, and puts it in bed and puts goat's hair on this fake person's head. And we know how the men came in. They wanted to kill David at that point. She said, "Well, he's sick." And so they go back to Saul and told him, and he said, "Well, I want to go see him." And so then they come and they find this fake person laying in the bed. Anyway, and so David at this point resorts to running for his life. There's one verse in chapter 23 I'd like to point out. This is when David is running for his life. It says, verse 16, "And Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David into the wood and strengthened his hand in God." And I'd like for all of us to be that Jonathan today. Thank you, Brad, for leading that this morning. I think that's how we can be Jonathans today. And not just in that way, but on a personal level of going to someone else and encouraging them in the difficulty that they're facing. And I think for us as well is to surround our people with, or surround ourselves with people who are willing to speak into our life, who are willing to be a good influence on us. Twice in 1 Samuel 24 and in 1 Samuel 26, David has the opportunity to kill Saul. So we know the story how David's running for his life. There's 600 men with him, and they go into a cave. Saul comes into the cave, and anyway, David's men say, "Hey, this is our opportunity. This is not just chance. God has delivered Saul into your hands. Let's kill him." And David said, "No, I'm not going to do that. I won't lift up my hand against God's anointed." And that's the first point I want to make is how did David make that decision? So he's supposed to be king. He knows he's supposed to be king, and he can't become king until the current king of Israel dies. And this king is trying to kill him. And we know David as a man of war, like killing wasn't off the map for him. Why in this situation, when he is worn out and tired of running, did he make the decision of saying, I won't do that. I can't do that. And I'd like to point that out. How did he have the strength to make that choice? Because oftentimes in life, I find for myself, and I think this is true for people, when we are worn out or we're tired, we're not at a good place to make good decisions. And David somehow made the right decision here. So anyway, that all happens. And in a sense, he had a bit of regret later, because we know how Saul went out of the cave. And well, first of all, for you children, Saul was there in the cave. David's men were there, and David comes up behind Saul and he cuts a piece off of his robe, and he regrets that later. But as he comes out of the cave and Saul has already left, he holds that up and he says, "Look what I did." And Saul at that point was like, "Oh, you could have killed me." And David was like, "Yes, I could have." And Saul's like, "I'm sorry, you're a better man than me, and he quit chasing him. Um, Later, Saul starts again, and later we find where they're camped at a place, and David and Joab go down to Saul's camp, and they're sleeping. And Joab, knowing David, that he wasn't going to lift his hand against him, basically said again, here's our opportunity. This is basically a divine appointment from God. Let me just spear him. And again, David says, no, you can't do that. I think too many times in our life, in those situations where we're worn out, we're not at a good place, the solution is comfort. And I think in this situation, the most easiest or the most comfortable thing for David would have been, let's just get him off of our hands. And he could have justified himself in a sense. His men were standing around him saying, this is what you need to do. This is what we're willing to do for you, so you don't have to feel guilty either. Anyway, in chapter 27, David eventually comes to the place where he says, you know what, I can't keep this up for real long. Saul is eventually going to catch me, and he's going to kill me. And so he goes to the land of the Philistines, and these were enemies of Israel. But he goes to the land of the Philistines into enemy territory, because he's saying, you know, if Saul comes after me there, he's obviously going to have to watch for his back there, and so he probably won't come there. So him and his 600 men, they go to Achish, king of Gath. And I find it interesting, and I'm not sure what happened here, but this is the same king that David acted insane to in chapter 21, and now he's going back to him. They had obviously worked something out where David had lived there for a while. But he goes to him and he says, you know what, it's not necessary, or I'm not worthy to live in the city here with the king in a royal city. Give me a town outside of the city that we can live. And we know how King Achish gave him Ziklag, and they went and lived there. And I don't know when these 600 men and their families, their wives, I don't think it would have been reasonable to think that the whole family or their families would have been running through this whole time. But eventually, these families show up in Ziklag. So David and his 600 men, they go and live in Ziklag in chapter 27, and it becomes theirs. It's their town, and this allowed them to live in a place of somewhat of peace. And through that time, David still would go out and fight armies. In a sense, he was still serving Saul. But anyway, he would go out and fight, and it formed a kind of peace that they were able to live there. Now, who were these 600 men that were with David? So initially, I think it started with 400, and then 200 others joined later. These were men that the Bible says were distressed, they were discontented, and in debt in Israel. They were not happy with the current situation or the current king in Israel. And they had hoped that in David, there would be a better solution to life. And so they voluntarily followed David. David wasn't paying them. In fact, they were sacrificing to be with him. And I don't know how many times David looked around and was like, this is pretty neat that these men have followed me. But they believed in David. I think he felt that. They believed in David. They were willing to stand with him. So one day, as they're there in Ziklag, the Philistines gathered together. They're going to go fight. And this is in chapter 28. I'm not sure where this is at. But anyway, they're going to go fight. And David agrees to join them. And he's going to join them. Anyway, Achish, he's on board with that. But the other leaders of the Philistines said, you know who this is? This is David. What happens if in the middle of battle he turns on us, and what's going to happen with that? And so anyway, they have a conversation about it. Achish comes back to to David and said, hey, you can't go with us, go back home. Now, from the time they left Ziklag till they had this conversation and got back home, the Bible says it was 3 days, and that's where it gets to chapter 30 here. Um, and they return after 3 days, and we know the story how they come back, and David, as a man of war, I don't know the situation, did he come up over a hill, but he gets to the city that, was it the Amalekites had destroyed. They had taken everything. They had burned the city down. There was nothing there. So you can imagine they were gone for 3 days, and they come back to a city that is theirs, and understand that they were not wanted back in their hometown. They weren't wanted there. They weren't accepted there, and now they have a little piece of their own, and they get back, and that's gone. Their wives, their family, everything is gone. I want us to get the depth of their situation. It talks about them weeping till they could weep no more. Like, this was a big, big problem. And in verse 6, it says, now David was greatly distressed. It's like, of course he was. He had just lost everything. He had lost his wives, his children, and the only place they had to call home. And there's a reason he's distressed. But it talks about these people, these 600 men that were with him. It said he was distressed because they were talking of stoning him. So now he's lost everything. These people who have voluntarily chose to follow him have said, David, we believe you, we support you, we're going to stand with you, are now saying, David, because of you, we're in this situation and it's your fault, we're going to stone you. So what do you do in this situation? Anyway, David has a problem, a big problem, and he needs a solution fast. And as we read across 1 Samuel, I think 18, in chapter 18, chapter 22, and chapter 23, it talks about the hard things that David is facing, but it says, but the Lord was with him. And in chapter 30, the verse I would like to get to, he's in this situation. These men are wanting to kill him. I did not write where that verse was down. But anyway, they come, verse 6. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spake of stoning him, because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and for his daughters. But David encouraged himself in the Lord his God. I don't know how long this took, but it says he encouraged himself in the Lord his God. And then it says he went back to the people, and these guys, these men were not at a good place. They were still talking about stoning him. And he goes back and he tells them the plan or the solution that God had given him. And we know the story how they go, and at this point they didn't know, were their wives, their families dead? They didn't know that. But they find this slave, and he tells them which direction the army went and where they're at, and they followed. And we if we read that story, they got everybody back, everything back, and they weren't harmed by that. But the thing I'd like for all of us to take away from today's message is, because David was connected to the source of strength, he found solutions to his problems. And so many times in life, when we are weak, we often choose poorly. I think that there's a reason why, and you've probably heard it in your life, just wait. You're not at a good place to make a wise decision, or you're not at a place to make a good decision. I think that's wisdom, is saying, hey, I recognize you're not at a place to make a good choice. And I think people would say, don't make big financial decisions after a death in the family. Like, don't make, you're not at a place to make a wise choice. Um, and can shut this down here, but I'd like to think of David in the way that he responded to life's choices. When he showed up at Elah there, it wasn't like, wow, here comes somebody with a slingshot. We've been waiting on somebody with a slingshot. No, I think he was saying um, David came with strength that the others didn't have. Um, Physically speaking, he wasn't qualified to fight this battle, but he had strength that the others didn't have. I'd like to read a couple verses in Isaiah yet. Verse 25 of Isaiah 40. To whom then will you liken me, or shall I be equal, saith the Holy One? Lift your eyes on high, and behold, who hath created those things that bringeth out their host by number? He calleth them all by their names, by the greatness of his might, for he is strong in power, not one faileth. Hast thou not known, hast thou not heard, that the everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, fainteth not, neither is weary. There is no searching of his understanding. Look how God is described here in this verse. He's described as the everlasting creator, or the everlasting God. He's been here throughout all times, the creator of the earth. He doesn't get weary. There is no searching of his understanding. He gets it. And I think if we can get that as well, that he has solutions for the problems that I face in life. Verse 29, he giveth power to the faint, and to them that have no might, he increaseth strength. Even the youth shall fail and be weary, and the young men shall utterly fail. So who's going to be the strong ones if the young men are weary and weak? Who's going to be the strong ones? Verse 31, but they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. You find your solution when you find your strength. Remember to seek the source of strength before you seek a solution, because like I said, oftentimes the devil is there with his solutions, and his solutions bring comfort. They bring numbing. Let's just push it down the road a little bit, or let's not deal with it today. But when we seek the source of strength, we find solutions to that. One more verse, 2 Corinthians 1. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves were comforted by God. For as we share abundantly in Christ's sufferings, so through Christ we share abundantly in comfort too. I will turn the time over to Daryl.